Stalingrad, September 1942, a German infantry squad has just taken the ground floor of an apartment building on the western outskirts of the factory district. The building is partially collapsed, 2 upper floors surviving, the stairwell intact, rooms on the left destroyed, rooms on the right still sealed. The squad leader orders his men to clear the stairwell. The first soldier opens the door at the bottom of the stairs. He does not get to the second step. The grenade attached by a thin wire to the door handle detonates at shin height. The squad loses 2 men. The others pull back, regroup, and wait for instructions. Their instructions do not come quickly, because the sergeant reporting back to company headquarters has to explain why an 8-man squad cannot clear a building that may or may not contain a single Soviet rifleman. The answer is that the building might contain no Soviet riflemen at all. The wire and the grenade were left behind by soldiers who are already 3 streets away, preparing the same thing for the next building. This is what Soviet grenade doctrine in Stalingrad actually looked like. Not the romantic image of soldiers charging across rubble-strewn streets with grenades in hand, though that happened too. The quieter, colder version, a wire tied to a pin tied to a fuse attached to 85 grams of TNT, left behind a door that any German soldier in the factory district would eventually need to open. The grenade did not require anyone to throw it. It required only someone to enter, to understand how the Soviet Union arrived at this point, at a grenade doctrine comprehensive enough to turn every doorframe in a city into a potential casualty event. You need to start not in Stalingrad, but with the weapon itself and with what the Red Army's designers understood about urban warfare that the German army did not until it was too late. The RGD-33 is not a beautiful object. Designed by Russian engineer Mikhail Grigorievich Dyakonov in 1933, and adopted to replace the aging model 1914 grenade, it is a stick grenade, the cylindrical head above a slimmer, cylindrical handle, a design philosophy the Soviet Union had inherited from Russian practice of the First World War, and that Germany had simultaneously developed into the famous steel hand granate. The RGD-33 is 190 millimeters long overall, 45 millimeters in diameter at the head, and weighs 500 grams, without its optional fragmentation sleeve. That sleeve, a cast-iron jacket of pre-serrated metal that slides over the head of the grenade and adds roughly 270 grams, converts the weapon from an offensive to a defensive configuration. Without it, the fragments lose velocity quickly in open air, and the effective kill radius is approximately 10 meters, narrow enough that the thrower can survive in the open if they have adequate distance. With the sleeve fitted, the fragmentation radius extends to approximately 15 meters, requiring the thrower to be behind cover before detonating. The TNT filling, 85 grams, sounds modest, but the geometry of enclosed spaces makes that number misleading. Overpressure from a detonation in a stairwell, a corridor, or a small room reflects off hard surfaces and arrives at a target from multiple directions simultaneously. The same charge that might stun a man in the open can kill 2 men in a corridor 6 meters away. Soviet soldiers and their commanders understood this from the earliest weeks of urban combat in 1941, and it shaped how they thought about grenades in a way that German doctrine never fully incorporated. The RGD-33's mechanism is worth examining in detail because it is simultaneously the weapon's most distinctive feature and the reason it became impossible to mass produce during a war that demanded mass production above everything else. The grenade is assembled in 3 separate pieces, the head containing the explosive, the handle, and the fuse. They were kept apart until just before use, the fuse stored in a wax paper-wrapped pouch, not in the grenade itself. Before throwing, the soldier had to insert the fuse from the top of the head, engage it against the safety mechanism, close the cover, and then push the safety slide from its white safe position to the red armed position. The grenade was then ready, but it would not detonate simply from being dropped or knocked over, because the actual firing mechanism was activated by the throwing motion itself. This is the engineering detail that makes the RGD-33 unique among the major grenades of the war. It uses an inertia-based arming system. The throwing arm, in the act of making a strong overhand swing, generates centrifugal force that disengages a latch in the handle, allowing the striker to fly forward and hit the primer. The delay train, 3.2 to 3.8 seconds, then burns, and the grenade detonates. This design means the grenade will not arm unless it is thrown with the correct vigorous motion. A weak throw might fail to arm it. A grenade sitting on a shelf will not explode. The safety features are, by the standards of 1930s design, genuinely comprehensive. They are also genuinely complex, and complexity is the enemy of wartime production. The IPMS/USA review of a restored RGD-33 describes the assembly process as consisting of multiple distinct steps requiring attention and care under any conditions, let alone in darkness, in extreme cold, with numb fingers, with incoming fire audible through the walls. The Forgotten Hope. Documentation drawing on historical sources notes that in reality, the RGD-33 required an incredibly lengthy and complex process to arm and throw. Soviet field manuals address this by specifying that the head, handle, and fuse should be assembled in advance by unit armorers before distribution to soldiers, leaving only the final fuse insertion for the individual soldier before throwing. Even then, the process required more steps and more attention than the German steel hand granate 24 demanded. The steel hand granate 24 was a simpler weapon in its operating procedure. The German stick grenade stored its pull cord inside the hollow wooden handle, sealed by a screw cap at the base. To use it, unscrew the cap, pull the cord. The friction igniter fires the delay train, 4 to 5 seconds, and the grenade is in the air. One cap, one pull, one throw. German soldiers could arm and throw a steel hand granate 24 in darkness, wearing gloves, having never practiced in the past week, and be confident it would work. The RGD-33 demanded more. Its 170 grams of TNT was twice the explosive content of the RGD-33's 85 grams, and its longer reach from the handle allowed throws of up to 40 meters against the RGD-33's 30 to 40 meters, roughly comparable. But the German weapon offered that range with a simpler mechanism. The Soviet Union recognized this problem before the war ended its first summer. The German invasion of June 1941 swept over enormous stretches of Soviet territory and captured or destroyed so much of the industrial base in the western regions that the remaining factories were overwhelmed with orders for everything simultaneously. The RGD-33 was too complex to produce in numbers that matched the demand. In 1942, designer S.G. Korshunov produced the answer, the RG-42. The RG-42 is almost aggressively unglamorous. It is a cylindrical stamped metal can, the kind of shape that holds preserved vegetables in a factory kitchen, filled with 110 to 120 grams of TNT and fitted with a UZRGM time fuse. The UZRGM is a pull-pin design. Remove the safety pin, release the spring-loaded lever, and the delay train, 3.2 to 4 seconds, begins. Total weight, 420 grams. Height, 121 millimeters. Diameter, 54 millimeters. There is a fragmentation liner inside the can that generates approximately 200 to 350 fragments on detonation. Effective kill radius against unprotected personnel in the open, around 3 meters at high lethality, with wounding out to approximately 25 meters. The production logic of the RG-42 is precisely what the Soviet war economy needed. The Wikipedia article on the RG-42 states it directly. Unlike the RGD-33, the RG-42 was a simple design, being little more than a steel sheet cylinder filled with explosives, required no casting, and was produced in existing can factories. IMAUSA's description of original specimens confirms that only the fuse required specialized manufacture, and the parts could be assembled by hand by cottage labor. Partisans made copies of the design when out of contact with supply lines. A weapon that can be replicated by a partisan cell in an occupied village is a weapon at the opposite end of the design philosophy from the RGD-33. And it was the right weapon for the moment the Soviet Union found itself in during 1942 and 1943. The F-1 fragmentation grenade, the Limonka, the Little Lemon, named for the shape and the yellow-green color, completed the Soviet grenade family alongside these two designs. Based on the French F-1 grenade of the First World War, the Soviet F-1 is a cast-iron body grenade weighing 600 grams with a 60-gram TNT charge. The notched cast-iron exterior fragments into approximately 290 high-velocity splinters on detonation, each weighing around a gram and leaving the grenade body at around 700 meters per second. The total fragment dispersion radius reaches up to 200 meters, though the effective radius, where fragments retain enough velocity to cause casualties, is approximately 30 meters. This makes the F-1 a strictly defensive grenade, thrown from behind hard cover, never in the open. A soldier who throws an F-1 without solid protection between themselves and the grenade's radius is as much at risk as their target. What the F-1's UZRGM fuse system offered, beyond the standard 3.5 to 4 second delay, was the capacity for zero delay variance, instantaneous detonation, specifically listed in Soviet documentation as designed for use in booby traps. This detail matters because it is the mechanical bridge between the grenade as a thrown weapon and the grenade as an architectural feature of Soviet urban defense. Now, before we get into exactly how Soviet soldiers used these weapons to make entire city blocks psychologically ungovernable for German forces, if this level of depth is what you came for, subscribe. It costs nothing, takes a moment, and helps the channel keep making content at this level. Let's get into what Stalingrad actually looked like from the inside. General Vasily Chuikov took command of the Soviet 62nd Army on September 11, 1942, with a mandate that was essentially a death sentence politely worded: defend Stalingrad at all costs. The city was already partially destroyed. German bombing had turned residential blocks into rubble fields, factory buildings into skeletal steel frames, and apartment buildings into internal mazes of collapsed floors and sealed rooms. Chuikov recognized immediately that this destruction was not a liability for the defender. It was an asset. Standard German military doctrine, the Blitzkrieg doctrine that had taken France in 6 weeks and pushed hundreds of kilometers into the Soviet Union in the opening months of Barbarossa, depended on combined arms coordination, tanks supported by infantry, infantry supported by artillery, aircraft providing close support, armored formations moving faster than the enemy could respond. Every element of that doctrine required space. Tanks needed room to maneuver. Artillery needed line of sight. Aircraft needed to identify targets without hitting their own troops. Stalingrad's rubble collapsed all of these requirements into a single, brutal reality. The effective range of combat was the distance from one man to the next, and every piece of cover that existed had been placed by someone who intended to fight from it. Chuikov formalized this understanding into a specific tactical instruction that the UPI analysis of the battle quotes directly from his memoirs: get close to the enemy's positions, move on all fours, making use of craters and ruins, carry your Tommy gun on your shoulder, take 10 or 12 grenades. Timing and surprise will then be on your side. Into the building, a grenade, a turn-in, another grenade, rake it with your Tommy gun, and get a move on. The tactical philosophy was articulated explicitly: maintain positions so close to German lines that German aircraft could not bomb Soviet positions without hitting their own troops. The Taylor article published in the Journal of Small Wars and Insurgencies on Stalingrad and the evolution of Soviet urban warfare notes that the 62nd Army used more grenades in the fight for Stalingrad than it did for the rest of the war. That single statistic captures what the battle actually was, not a campaign decided by artillery exchanges at range or by armored breakthroughs, but a sustained close-range contest in which the hand grenade was the primary offensive tool. The Storm Group, which Chuikov encouraged regimental commanders to form from the end of September 1942 onward, was the organizational expression of this philosophy. A typical Storm Group consisted of a platoon of infantry, 20 to 50 men, supported by 2 or 3 artillery pieces repositioned for direct fire, 1 or 2 squads of combat engineers and chemical warfare specialists, and whenever possible, a tank. The combat engineers were not there only to breach obstacles. They were there to prepare the buildings the Storm Group intended to hold after taking them, and that preparation included the grenade tripwires, the wired door frames, the tension pin devices set under loose floorboards, and the carefully tied lengths of wire at shin height across stairwells that made held buildings lethal to recapture. The psychological taxonomy of what this created is worth naming precisely because the numbers alone do not capture it. The WW2DB documentation on booby traps notes from American casualty statistics that only 0.2% of deaths and 0.5% of injuries during the war were directly attributable to booby traps. But the same source immediately qualifies this with the observation that booby traps caused a great amount of unquantifiable damage from a psychological and morale standpoint, and that the thought that the enemy might have booby-trapped every seemingly typical item could cause a unit to move slower than they were capable of, spending effort avoiding traps that might or might not have been there. The cost of a booby trap is not just the casualty it inflicts. It is every minute of hesitation and every meter of ground it denies without detonating. In Stalingrad's factory district, where German forces were attempting to clear buildings room by room, what they called Rattenkrieg, rat war, that hesitation had a direct military consequence. A squad that pauses to check a door for wire before opening it is a squad that has given up the initiative. A squad that does not check and hits a wire is a squad that will check every subsequent door more carefully, more slowly. The balance between caution and speed that combat demands tilts permanently toward caution when the enemy has established that every threshold might be the last one. German soldiers stationed themselves on ground floors while Soviet defenders held upper floors, firing down through holes in the ceiling. Key buildings changed hands as many as 15 times. The life expectancy of a Soviet soldier arriving in the city was measured in hours. But the German army that entered Stalingrad, expecting to seize it in days, was still fighting for individual rooms 90 days later. The window and grenade interaction described in the Stevens-Balogan historical analysis of Stalingrad tactics captures one specific adaptation that illustrates how granular this warfare became. Soviet soldiers trapped in defensive positions with German forces pressing from multiple directions mounted wire netting over windows to prevent grenades from being thrown in. German soldiers responded by attaching grappling hooks to the netting and pulling it free, then following immediately with grenades through the cleared window. Soviet soldiers responded by preparing grenades on short fuses to be thrown at the German hook operators. The instant the netting was pulled, a weapon designed in 1933 by an engineer working from First World War experience was being used in a tactical innovation cycle that neither side had anticipated when the war began. The Soviet anti-tank grenade family, the RPG-40, RPG-43, and RPG-6, added a further dimension to this arsenal that is often overlooked in accounts that focus purely on personnel weapons. The RPG-40, designed by M.I. Puzirev and entering service in July 1941, was a contact-detonated blast grenade containing 760 grams of TNT, nearly 9 times the explosive content of the RGD-33's anti-personnel charge. It weighed 1.2 kilograms and had an effective throwing range of 20 to 25 meters, which meant the thrower had to expose themselves significantly to use it. Against the early Panzer I, II, and III series, it could penetrate approximately 20 millimeters of armor through blast effect. Against the Panzer IV and later German vehicles, its penetration was inadequate, leading to the RPG-43 in 1943, a shaped charge heat weapon capable of defeating heavier armor. What neither of these weapons was primarily was a thrown charge designed for use in a building, but Soviet soldiers in Stalingrad used them against fortified German positions within structures, against vehicles attempting to cross rubble in narrow streets, and bundled together in improvised demolition charges against walls they needed to breach or collapse. The comparison with German grenade doctrine throughout this period reveals a fundamental asymmetry that Germany never successfully closed. The steel hand granate 24 was a better individual weapon in many tactical situations, simpler to use, twice the explosive filling, comparable throwing range, and manufacturable by the millions at German standards. It was also not a weapon whose fuse system accommodated booby trap configurations easily, given that the friction pull cord mechanism required deliberate activation. The hand granate 39, Germany's egg grenade, a compact alternative that the Wehrmacht used alongside the steel hand granite, had a pull cord under a screw cap that could be connected to a tripwire, and documented German practice on the eastern and western fronts did use these as booby traps when abandoning positions. But German forces were attacking in Stalingrad, not defending a retreat. The booby trap arsenal was a defender's arsenal. The Soviets were defending. Britain's Mills grenade, the number 36, used a lever and pin system simple to use, with a 7-second delay in some configurations. The American Mark II, the pineapple grenade, used a similar lever and pin. Both were reliable weapons. Neither was designed with the dual-mode offensive and defensive switching that the RGD-33's fragmentation sleeve system provided, and neither was manufactured in facilities that had previously been canning factories. The RG-42's production adaptability, the fact that its body could be made in facilities already equipped to seal cylindrical metal containers, is the Soviet Union's genuine contribution to wartime manufacturing philosophy applied to this category of weapon. The same industrial logic that made the PPSH-41 manufacturable in furniture factories made the RG-42 manufacturable wherever sheet metal and a basic folding seam machine existed. The scale of what this produced is documented in the academic analysis of Stalingrad's evolution as a doctrine. The 62nd Army's grenade consumption exceeding everything it used for the rest of the war is not simply a statement about Stalingrad's intensity, it is a statement about the decision made by Soviet commanders to treat the grenade as the primary tactical weapon of urban warfare and to supply it in quantities that made that doctrine operationally sustainable. Chekhov's instruction to carry 10 or 12 grenades per soldier into a building assault is not a figure plucked from thin air. It reflects the calculation that an assault on a prepared building would consume grenades at that rate or faster, and that arriving short would mean dying in a corridor with an empty hand. The parallel doctrine of leaving grenades behind when withdrawing completed the tactical picture. A Soviet position held and then surrendered, whether by tactical withdrawal or by being overrun, was a position that cost the Germans in two phases. First, in the taking, where Soviet defenders sold ground at maximum price with small arms fire, grenades thrown around corners and down stairwells, and anti-tank rifles positioned to engage German assault guns at building clearing range. Then in the occupation, where the German troops who had just paid a high price to enter the building discovered that the previous occupants had prepared a second bill. None of this required sophisticated technology. It required wire. It required the recognition that a grenade with its pin removed and held in place by a tension device, a door, a floorboard, a piece of furniture, is a time bomb set not for seconds, but for whenever the enemy next interfered with that object. The F1 grenade, with its documented zero-delay fuse variant specifically manufactured for booby trap use, was the weapon of choice for this application. The cast-iron fragmentation body that made it too dangerous to use in the open without cover became an advantage when installed in a stairwell. The fragments that in open ground might wound at 30 meters would, in the confined geometry of an apartment building, have no room to dissipate. They would travel through doorframes, through walls, across landings. The same grenade became geometrically more lethal indoors than outdoors. Chekhov's soldiers understood this. German soldiers learned it, building by building, stairwell by stairwell, across the autumn and winter of 1942. By November 1942, when German forces nominally controlled approximately 90% of the city's surface area, they controlled almost none of it in the sense of being able to move through it freely. The buildings they held required constant defensive effort to maintain because every building in the Soviet doctrine was a potential counterattack position. The storm groups that Chekhov's forces had refined were optimized for exactly the kind of assault that exploited prepared positions the Germans themselves now occupied. The legacy of this doctrine is not theoretical, modern military doctrine for urban combat, what Western militaries call military operations in urban terrain. MOUT incorporates the lesson that Stalingrad taught in 1942 explicitly, that a retreating force that prepares the terrain it surrenders imposes costs on its replacement that extend far beyond the moment of handover. The booby trap is not a weapon of vengeance. It is a weapon of time. It imposes delay, and in urban combat where the clock favors the defender, delay is the most valuable currency there is. The Soviet grenade, specifically the F1 with its instantaneous delay fuse variant, used as a tripwire device in prepared positions, was the physical expression of that doctrine. It was not sophisticated. It was a cast iron body, 60 grams of TNT, and a length of wire. It did not require a skilled soldier to deploy it. It did not require any soldier to be present when it activated. It required only a German soldier who needed to open a door, and doors in Stalingrad's factory district were everywhere. Return to that apartment building in September 1942. The squad that lost 2 men to the wire at the bottom of the stairwell. They pull back. They report. Their sergeant explains why an 8-man squad cannot clear a building. The answer is that they can clear the building, but the cost of clearing it without knowing what was left behind is 2 men per doorframe, and nobody in the 6th Army has found a reliable method of knowing which doors have wires and which do not except opening them. The psychological effect of that uncertainty is not quantifiable in casualties. It is quantifiable in pace, in the speed at which German forces moved through Stalingrad, which was measured in rooms per day rather than streets per hour, and which consumed an army's worth of men in a city that was supposed to fall in a week. The Soviet grenade did not win Stalingrad alone. Artillery won it, and encirclement won it, and the discipline of soldiers who knew the Volga was behind them and had been told there was nothing behind the Volga. But the grenade, thrown around corners, left on wires in stairwells, bundled together against walls, carried into every close assault at 10 or 12 per man, was the instrument of a specific kind of dominance. The dominance of a defender who has decided that every square meter of their ground will cost the attacker something, and that a meter surrendered is a meter prepared. That was the Soviet grenade doctrine in Stalingrad, not suicidal, methodical.